I don't know about you, but I thought it was good time for an early morning red pill session. And I was just reading some of my works that I've written about the Soviet Union, and I believe that it was an experiment created by the Jesuits to mimic what they had created during the Paraguayan reductions. During the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, the Jesuits had brought Guarani Indians into a compound and enslaved them by getting them high on coca leaf the whole time and feeding them Roman Catholicism, basically mass each evening. And they kept these Guarani Indians as dumb and unconscious as they possibly could, and completely enslaved the Guarani Indians couldn't leave the Jesuit compounds. So it seems to me that the Soviet Union was a Jesuit experiment. They decided to try out the reductions as they had carried out in Paraguay again, but this time in a more technocratic atmosphere. So they industrialized the Soviet Union on purpose during the 20s and brought Stalin in, specifically as he believed in socialism in one country. They needed Stalin specifically because of his ideology of socialism in one country. They couldn't have virtually half the world trying to become communist because they couldn't contain their experiment that way. And that's kind of exactly what happened. Half of the world suddenly tried to become communist after having seen what the Soviet Union had done. Well, what the Jesuits had created in the Soviet Union. They believed this was an amazing ideology, even though Marxism and Marx was a Jesuit creation. He was tutored by Jesuits, and Soviet Union was set up by Jesuits. Indeed, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, they were all Sabbatean and Frankist Jesuits, or funded by Jesuits, or Jesuit trained, as Stalin was trained in a Jesuit university in Tiflis in Georgia, and he was mentored by Father Edmund Walsh, who was the head of Georgetown University. Georgetown University is the major Jesuit university in the United States, and the Jesuits resident at Georgetown, they dictate US foreign policy from Georgetown, and indeed there are tunnels leading from Georgetown to the White House, giving the high-ranking Jesuits direct contact with the leadership of the US government. But back to the fact that they needed Stalin because of his socialism in one country rather than Trotsky's global revolution is simply because they needed to contain the experiment within a certain amount of space. And indeed, that was why during the Cold War, the Jesuits utilized the CIA and the American troops so much. For instance, the intervention in Vietnam was wholeheartedly supported most avidly by Cardinal Spellman, the Archbishop of New York. Indeed, many call the Vietnam War Spelly's War. And being an archbishop, Cardinal Spellman would have been initiated into the Jesuit Illuminati, as are all Catholic archbishops and anyone above that rank. So, indeed, there couldn't be communism in Vietnam. It had to stay in the Soviet Union. And indeed, there were communist revolutions all over the world, in Africa, Central America, and especially in the case of Central America during Reagan's reign, these regimes were put down with an iron fist. And this was simply because of the Jesuit policy of trying to contain their reduction, Marxist, Leninist, Bolshevist, Paraguayan reduction, neo-Paraguayan reduction experiment in one nation. But also, you notice, the US sent military troops into Vietnam and Rhodesia's war, and Central America, and Grenada, and all those sorts of places where socialism and communism were rising, but they never actually touched the Soviet Union itself. Indeed, with the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Warsaw Pact, the fact that the Soviet Union pretty much took East Germany and much of Eastern Europe as satellites was a concept that the Jesuits didn't mind, because they were direct satellites of the Soviet Union, and it was simply an expanded Soviet Union, and they could still contain the experiment within the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union itself. So Stalin was very much a pawn of the Jesuits, and he didn't ask for more than he ended up with at Yalta, with East Germany and Eastern Europe becoming under Soviet control. He didn't ask for any more than that, simply because he was a pawn of the Jesuits. Indeed, the first real conflict of the Cold War was the Greek Civil War, and the British and then the Americans both followed a path of heavy interventionism in Greece, and this was due to an agreement that the British and American governments, and the Vatican, of course, backing them, and the Jesuits of Georgetown had made an agreement with Stalin that Greece would be in the Western sphere of influence. Thus, Stalin didn't send any real help to the communist forces. The only communist nation that did was Yugoslavia, and in I believe it was 1948, Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union split and no longer were part of one bloc, and Yugoslavia spent the next 50 years basically taking massive amounts of money, bribes from the West, not to rejoin the Warsaw Pact. And indeed it carved its own way. It was a sort of half capitalist, half communist nation. But indeed the Greek Civil War failed. The communist forces lost because of the split between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. Because when the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia split, the Greek communists were given a choice to support the Soviet Union or support Russia, even though the Soviet Union weren't really sending that much support. But the Greek communists chose to stay with the Soviet Comintern, which was stupid, because Stalin wasn't going to give them any support, because he'd already agreed to give Greece to the West. So the communists were not only not getting any support from the Soviet Comintern, they also lost their bases in Yugoslavia, because most of their weapons caches were across the border in what would have been southern Macedonia. Well, now would have been former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, as they like to call it. It's being changed, the name changed to the Republic of Northern Macedonia soon, I believe. But yeah, most of their bases were in southern Yugoslavia, which was southern Macedonia of today. And the Greek communists were now cut off from those bases. Thus, the fascist and monarchist forces, many of which had been outright collaborators with the Nazis during the Second World War, directly supported by Britain and America, could easily clean up and destroy the communist forces in Greece, and thus Greece became a Western proxy and indeed very soon a member of NATO. But this all links back to the idea of socialism in one country, Stalin's ideology. The reason that the Jesuits so wanted Jesuit-trained Stalin was not only because he was a Jesuit, but because he would contain their experiment. And indeed all Soviet Union was a technocratic reduction. When I say reduction, I refer to the Paraguayan reductions, as I spoke about at the beginning of this rant. And it was a technocratic reduction with gulags. Indeed, in 1946 there was something like 120 million slaves in Russia or something mad. In the Soviet Union, that would have been almost half the population at the time, because Soviet Union didn't just contain Russia at that time. It was also Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, and of course the countries of the Warsaw Pact added. No, it can't have been 120 million. That's ridiculous. It must have been 40 million or something. I think I'm getting my figures confused here. But I know that Stalin murdered about 66 million people, which makes Hitler look like a Sunday school teacher. But Stalin's barbarity was most probably because of his initial training at Tiflis University, which was a Jesuit university. And so he had the heartlessness of a Jesuit, as the Jesuits will do anything to further their aims. And by this point, the Jesuits were no longer concerned with what they were concerned with prior to the Congress of Vienna. Before that, they were simply concerned with getting the thrones of Europe back to the Pope. And with the completion of that oath, they not only found out in 1815 that they'd completed their initial mission, and in many ways what they'd been formed by papal bull for, but they also had now become the papacy. The Jesuits were now in control of the papacy. The Jesuits have been in control of the papacy since 1814. And there were then another two congresses. You had the Congress of Verona in 1822, which pretty much decided that the Jesuits should put all of their energy into bringing the United States back into the fold of the papacy, and that they would colonize it the way they had Britain during 1773 to 1815. And indeed they believed they had a right to, because of the concessions King John had made to the Pope Innocent III, of England, its holdings, its population, its lands, and in 1215 its throne and its monarchy. So everything British basically belonged to the papacy, and the papacy were by this time the Jesuits. And that included America, because America was little more than an extension of the Virginia Company, which was a British company. So America was naturally papal land, and who were the papacy by this point? The Jesuits were the papacy. Thus America was Jesuit land. And so the Congress of Verona was, in 1822, was to plan out how they were going to colonize America. And they did this by getting their British allies, Lord Palmerston, to initiate a famine in Ireland, which caused a mass exodus of Catholics to the United States. And very soon, Catholicism became the major religion in the United States. It was a very, very clever plan. Genocidal, but I don't think the Jesuits really care how many lives they sacrifice in their aims. And indeed, they think 120 years ahead of the game. Very intelligent breed. And indeed, since 1814, 1815, they've been free to advance the agenda of their masters, and their masters, even though they operate on their own a lot of the time, they are directly allied to the ultra-aristocracy, which is an alliance of a lot of European bloodlines, Merovingians, Genoese, Habsburgs, with the British peerage. And there's a lot of intermarriage between them. And indeed the Rothschilds are also a part of that. The Rothschilds have recently married in with the Aldebrandinis, which means they've jumped several tiers in the Aldobrandini is one of the top tiers of the ultra-aristocracies. Some people like to call them the aristocratia nera, or the black nobility, but I prefer the term ultra-aristocracy. And the last Congress that the Jesuits held during this time was in 1824, the Congress of Chieri, which, thanks to Abate Leone, what was said at that Congress was leaked, and the whole Jesuit plan for world domination was leaked. And by this guy Abate Leone, who accidentally overheard the Jesuit masters discussing their plan for world domination. And indeed, from the bits I've read, it reads very similar to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which are also a Jesuit ultra-aristocratic plot. Just since the Okhrana leaked it, the Jesuits and their masters, ultra-aristocratic masters, have managed to deceive the public that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a Pharisaic Masonic plot, when it's not. It was a Jesuit and ultra-aristocratic plot. It reads very similar to not only the Jesuit secret history, but also the words written down by Abate Leone when he was overhearing the Congress at Chieri in 1824. And so not only was the United States a target for colonization just as Britain had been, and they believed it legitimized because of the concessions of King John in 1213 and 1215. The Jesuits also needed to cement their control over the papacy. Even though they had complete control over the Curia, there could still be threats. And this was completed by 1870 with the doctrine of papal infallibility. And in 1870, the Jesuit conquest of the papacy was completely over. Even though it had been basically completed by 1815, and every pope since 1815 has been a Jesuit puppet, but the 1870 Act of Papal Infallibility cemented the control of the Jesuits over the papacy. And from that point on, they were able to carry out such experiments as they did in the Soviet Union. And of course, they brought forth Stalin. Stalin was their man. Stalin was Jesuit trained. He was Jesuitical in all of his ways, and he was genocidal as a Jesuit. So it tells you what they're like and what kind of society the Jesuits and the wider Illuminati and the ultra aristocracy are trying to create for us. Is what China was allowed to go communist also, specifically because of Bertrand Russell's ideology. He created Maoism, and Maoism began as a more agricultural communist revolution, but developed into a mixture of capitalism, corporatism, communism, and a police state. And what China is now is in many ways the prototype for how the ultra aristocracy wish the West to become. And they are shuffling the West in that direction to a society similar to China, with corporatism, a level of sort of a communist peasant commune, and a very, very strict police state. And as they do that, they're gradually going to start working their depopulation plans, which are organized by the Percy family along British Catholic dynasty and the Club of Rome. And they're using the New Age movement utilizing the New Age movement to carry out depopulationism and Malthusianism. And it's all happening under the veil of environmentalism. That's why you've got these documentaries like Zeitgeist. It's all controlled opposition, it's disinformation. They want you to follow that because they want to depopulate the earth. And as they shuffle Britain towards this society laid out by Bertrand Russell and acted out by Mao, in combination with other influences, there's a lot of fascist influence in there, and of course, naturally, the Jesuits have a hand in it, so there's a lot of, it's very feudal what's coming. And then after depopulation will be all-out feudalism, basically an enslaved world, a slavocracy, a feudal slavocracy, dominated by the ultra-aristocracy with the Jesuits as mediators. Indeed, it may be wise to describe it as a worldwide equivalent of the Paraguayan reductions. And this is going to take place. It could take place over the next 10 years, or it could take place over the next 200. So we can only speculate. But what you need to know is that the Jesuits are one of the main forces behind this. When you say it, people laugh because they think, oh, the Jesuits, they're just this Catholic group of teachers and medics that all they do is set up missionary camps in countries and teach people. But it's bollocks. They are a genocidal, vulgar group. And indeed, you hear young people even talk about the Illuminati. Who created the Illuminati? The Jesuits created the Illuminati. The Illuminati are an extension of the Jesuits. And indeed, this is occurring, and this is an experiment, just as the Soviet Union was an experiment. It's just the experiments now become worldwide, and gradually watching it'd be phased in. Indeed, I did write here, the entire Cold War scenario was engineered as puppetry by Jesuit puppeteers resident at Georgetown University, and indeed the whole scenario of the Cold War was organized and dictated from Georgetown University by the resident Jesuits there. They used their own experiment, the Soviet Union, as propaganda to use as an enemy, so they could keep the military-industrial pharmaceutical complex going and keep the corporations in business as they created more machinery for warfare, supposedly for use against the big enemy, which was actually a Jesuit experiment. And then since then they've been able to expand that war on communism to the war on drugs and the war on terror, so it's all artificially created and dictated from Georgetown University and the Jesuits resident there, and ultimately from Borgio Santo Spirito, which is the home of the Jesuits in Rome, where the grey Jesuit, high Jesuit, arch Jesuit families dwell, and all foreign policy is dictated through the Jesuit order and by the ultra aristocrats who form circles around high Jesuitry. Now, that's a red pill for the morning. I'm going to fade out, have a cup of coffee. Farewell.